Inshallah, Palestine will soon be free. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Pakistan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
Thank you, Mr. President. I congratulate you on presiding over the General Assembly, and we would like to associate ourselves with the statements delivered by the Non-Aligned Movement, the OIC, and the Arab Group. We meet today, Mr. President, after the Arab and Islamic groups and the Non-Aligned Movement requested the resumption of the 10th Emergency Special Session to submit the draft resolution before us today, A/ES-10/L31, which, and for the first time in the history of the General Assembly, is being submitted by the State of Palestine, and it pertains to the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on the legal consequences arising from Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and that is an implementation of GA Resolution 77/247 of the year 2022. Mr. President, Palestine, and with the support of peace-loving countries that believe in international law and the United Nations Charter and the need to maintain its credibility, sought this advisory opinion and seeks to have clear resolutions from the General Assembly and Security Council out of a genuine belief of the need for a peaceful solution to the Palestinian cause in accordance with international law and the United Nations Charter, and out of a sincere belief that violence will never be the solution for the conflict in the Middle East. Mr. President, the ICJ's advisory opinion reveals that the Palestinian people's right to self-determination and ending occupation and establishing a Palestinian state on the 4th of June 1967 lines, with East Jerusalem as its capital, is a right that is clear and evident. The ICJ also found that the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip is in violation of international law. It considered occupation a blatant violation of the right to self-determination, which is a preemptory norm of international law. It also found that the continued use of armed force on foreign territories with the aim of annexing them to Israel and imposing its sovereignty on them lacks legitimacy. The Israeli practices against Palestinians in the occupied territory are in violation of Article 3 of the Convention on the Prohibition of Racial Discrimination, not to mention the findings that the ICJ arrived at that oblige Israel to end occupation, including the dismantling of its settlements, evacuating settlers, and making reparations to Palestinians, and allowing all Palestinians displaced during the occupation to return to their original place of residence. Mr. President, we remind you all that most of the points mentioned in the current ICJ opinion was acknowledged by the same court 20 years ago in its advisory opinion on the separating wall. That opinion remained as ink on paper. Mr. President, Egypt finds that the advisory opinion recognizes that the international community as a whole has legal obligations, and this applies to all member states of the United Nations. Legal obligations including working on enabling the Palestinian people to exercise their right to self-determination. Moreover, it prohibits any measures that may imply a recognition of the occupation or the conditions it creates. This includes transferring embassies to the occupied Palestinian territory, or engaging in agreements or establishing trade ties with Israeli activities that are related to the occupation. Moreover, the advisory opinion found that the United Nations and all of its political bodies and specialized agencies are obliged as well to work on ending the occupation and taking the necessary measures to guarantee that Israel abides by the ICJ's opinion that occupation must end immediately. We stress that the Israeli occupation, with its settlements and its extremist settlers, would not be viable if countries that respect international law and the ICJ's opinions decide to boycott it and cease cooperating and coexisting with it. Putting an end to the occupation and deterring Israel's hostile behavior against the Palestinian people is an urgent necessity to maintain international peace, international security, or what remains of regional stability after Israel has gone too far in its violations perpetrated throughout its occupation of the Palestinian territories. Moreover, Israel has gone too far in its aggression against the United Nations itself, in that it killed more than 220 United Nations staff members, as it continues to adopt a law that would criminalize the UNRWA and consider it a terrorist organization. This is an unprecedented action where a United Nations body is labeled as terrorist. Mr. President, the ICJ's opinion comes out as the Israeli war machine continues to destroy the Gaza Strip. It has killed over 40,000 martyrs and has injured over 94,000 Palestinians. It has obstructed the delivery of humanitarian aid in a violation of international law and relevant United Nations resolutions, especially Resolution 2720, issued by the Security Council. There is no clear horizon to put an end to the suffering of the Palestinian people. Moreover, Israel is launching a military campaign against the West Bank, and it encourages settlement activity in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. It threatens the status quo of religious holy places in Jerusalem. It continues to enforce limitations on the work of the Palestinian Authority, which is the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. All of this aims to eliminate the presence of Palestinians on their land and to liquidate their cause. Mr. President, here we would like to renew our demands that the Security Council must issue a resolution under Chapter 7 that would oblige Israel to immediately cease hostilities and to allow the unfettered access of humanitarian aid to maintain international peace and security, and hold Israel accountable for its violation of international law and its non-implementation of Security Council resolutions. Mr. President, Egypt believes in supporting regional peace and stability. In that, we continue our mediation efforts along with Qatar and the United States to arrive at a ceasefire deal and to put an end to this unprecedented tragedy. Egypt is doing so within its regional and international responsibilities, and we choose to disregard some reckless statements made by the Israeli Prime Minister against Egypt. These statements only aim to distract Israeli public opinion and obstruct mediation efforts. Egypt will continue working with our Arab brethren and international partners to resume the peace process and to launch a mediation process a negotiations process that would guarantee the Palestinian people the right in a liberated country that is contiguous on the lands within the borders of the 4th of June 1967, with East Jerusalem at its capital, in accordance with international criteria and resolutions and the peace process which acknowledges the two-state solution. This requires us all to exert a genuine effort and to be committed by turning words into deeds in the international community and through responding with and working with Arab efforts. This requires a firm position with Israel to force it to return to the negotiations table and end occupation after the recent escalation shows the impossibility of the theory that Israel's security is based on force and power. For the sake of what is right, for the sake of what is just, Egypt asks you to vote in favor of the draft resolution that will be presented tomorrow in order to maintain and preserve the credibility of this organization, to support a peaceful resolution to the Palestinian cause and other causes, to maintain our rights to live in dignity and in freedom, and to uphold justice and what is right. I thank you, sir.
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Mr. President, let me begin by congratulating you on assuming the presidency of the General Assembly and to express our appreciation for convening this 10th emergency special session. This session reflects the gravity of the situation and the collective responsibility of this body to address it. As a co-sponsor of this resolution introduced by Palestine and a committed advocate of the International Court of Justice proceedings, Turkey regards this session as both timely and essential. Mr. President, the Court's advisory opinion delivered on July 19th, upon the request of this august body, categorically determined the illegality of Israel's deliberately prolonged occupation of Palestinian territories. The ICJ's ruling, as the highest judicial body within the UN system, reaffirms what has long been the consensus of the international community, which is the occupation is lawful and must be ended. This conclusion not only provides a legal foundation, but also reinforces the political will of the majority of member states. The forthcoming vote on the resolution presented by Palestine is of historical significance. It not only constitutes the first resolution presented by Palestine to the General Assembly, but also symbolizes a pivotal step in the Palestinian people's pursuit of justice. The resolution is not merely procedural. It is emblematic of a broader movement within the international community to rectify long-standing injustices. Therefore, vital that we, as the member states, act in line with the ICJ's findings and the principles enshrined in the UN Charter. Turkey urges all member states to support this resolution as it is consistent with the international law and the legal framework established by the ICJ. The resolution's adoption would mark a crucial reaffirmation of the collective commitment to upholding international legal norms. Mr. President, this resolution underscores three critical dimensions of the current situation. First, it reinforces the fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter and international law. Implementing the Court's advisory opinion is imperative if we are to uphold the core principle that territorial acquisition by force is inadmissible. Second, the international community must signal clearly that violations of international law will not be tolerated. The occupation and ongoing settlement activities in the West Bank are not only illegal, but undermine the prospects for peace. Accountability in this case is not just a moral imperative, but a legal one. Third, the ongoing conflict in Gaza, now in its 11th month, exacerbates an already dire humanitarian crisis. The resolutions passed by this Assembly, as well as the Security Council resolutions 2728 and 2725, calling for a ceasefire, remain unheeded. The suffering of the Palestinian people continues unabated, and the lack of the implementation highlights the urgent need for concrete action. Adoption of the resolution is crucial to reinforce the international community's call for a ceasefire and to halt the illegal settlement activities that perpetuate the conflict. Turkey has been an active participant in the ICJ process, contributing both written and oral submissions to the advisory opinion. We will continue our efforts to ensure an immediate and lasting ceasefire, as well as unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza, and work towards the recognition of the State of Palestine and a viable two-state solution. In conclusion, the decisions made in this Assembly will have lasting implications, not only for the Palestine, but for the credibility of international law and the UN. The international community must demonstrate that it is prepared to enforce the standards it has set, and that justice, even it is delayed, will ultimately prevail. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Turkey. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting. Mr. President, international law is the pillar of a stable global society, ensuring justice, protection of freedom, and enabling countries to thrive. Without them, chaos disrupts global peace and progress. The ICJ, the world's court, has made it clear: Israel's occupation of Palestine is illegal. Continued global inaction, enabled through the might is right, has allowed this occupation to thrive, causing injustice and tremendous suffering to the Palestinian people. The Assembly must now act on the ICJ ruling. The occupation must end. Indonesia therefore wholeheartedly support the draft resolution tabled by the State of Palestine. It contains legitimate actions that address these injustices. In this context, allow me to emphasize 3 points. First, implementation of the ICJ advisory opinion is the embodiment of our belief and commitment to international law and order. The ruling is more than just legal authority. It is a moral imperative. All states must recognize the State of Palestine, support the full membership in the United Nations, and uphold its rights to self-determination. The systematic structure of apartheid, discrimination, and injustice must be dismantled. Second, we must safeguard the integrity of the UN Charter and our basic human value. Allowing the illegal occupation of Palestine to continue undermines the very foundation of the international system that was built to preserve justice, moral value, and humanity. Let us be honest. Can we say to the children in Gaza, in the West Bank, and East Jerusalem that there will be a tomorrow for them? No, we cannot. We cannot even say this to children staying in Israelis' designated humanitarian safe zone. In the eyes of the general public, this body's default position is standing idle, while the basic right to life of Palestinians is taken away by a vindictive government. What will remain of the sanctity of international law? Third, we must pursue political solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The clarity of the ICJ ruling is the illegality of Israel-Palestine occupation of Palestine. We must demand all of us to take a clear political will that we must safeguard the two-state solution. We need to convene an international conference for peace negotiation where Palestine stands on equal footing. The time for decisive action is now. We must move towards peace. Mr. President, let us act to resolve, to ensure that the promise of peace and dignity becomes a reality for every child and human being in Gaza and beyond. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malta.
President, Excellencies, on 19 July, the International Court of Justice, upon the request of this General Assembly, delivered its advisory opinion regarding the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. The court found that Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is unlawful, and that it is under an obligation to end it as soon as possible. Among the legal consequences emanating from this advisory opinion is a responsibility on the part of the General Assembly, as well as the Security Council, to consider the precise modalities and further action required to end Israel's unlawful presence. In this context, Malta reaffirms its unwavering commitment to international law. Adherence to it is essential to advancing peace, security, and justice. Respecting and implementing the findings of international judicial institutions, including the ICJ, is fundamental. All states must respect the decisions of our institutions and cooperate fully in their implementation. Our multilateral system depends on it. President, across the occupied Palestinian territory, Palestinians have been facing a desperate reality for 57 years. They are forced to contend with discriminatory legislation and frequent human rights violations. A continued occupation will only serve to make the two-state solution and the inalienable right of the Palestinian people to self-determination seem like a distant and unattainable abstraction. As member states, we have a responsibility to move this forward, a duty outlined by the ICJ. This includes not recognizing as legal Israel's unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory and not to render aid or assistance in maintaining this occupation. All settlement activities must cease immediately. They are illegal under international law, undermine the contiguity of a future Palestinian state, and are a breach of the Palestinian people's fundamental right to self-determination. President, tens of thousands of civilians have been killed in the Gaza war, and many more have had their lives destroyed. Hostages abducted by Hamas and their families continue to live through a perpetual nightmare. An immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza needs to be realized urgently. The hostages must be immediately and unconditionally released. We have echoed this message consistently since 7th October. This catastrophic war has only illustrated the need to address the root causes of this conflict and take tangible steps towards the realization of the two-state solution in line with Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. This path requires courage, principled decisions, and full respect of international law. This is why Malta will be supporting the resolution before us today. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malta. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Libya.
Mr. President, in the outset, allow me to speak in English, as I wish today to have my messages sent clear and not lost in translation. At the same time, I would like to align myself with the statements of the Arab group, the Islamic group, and the non-alignment movement. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to debate this resolution regarding the advisory opinion of the ICJ on the legal consequences arising from the unlawful occupation by the Israeli forces of the Palestinian territory, which Libya was proud to join its deliberations. This resolution presented by the delegation of the State of Palestine is by itself a historic moment, being the first action they take after getting their deserved, long-awaited privileges since the starting of this 29th year session. Unfortunately, they had to wait 79 years for that to happen. So in that regard, it's important to remind you that it's about time also to grant them the full membership of the United Nations. But while I'm standing here before you today, I find myself challenged and struggling to understand what are we exactly debating. Ordinary people watching us would question this, because simply we are debating whether we should comply with the legal findings of the most prominent, prestigious international institution, the International Court of Justice. We are debating whether or not we should comply with international law. As much as this ICJ advisory is important and timely, but we should not at all neglect the fact that the occupation of the Palestinian territories has been and will remain unlawful. And none of you ever needed to wait all these decades for such advisory opinion to know that. But here we are. And the real test begins now. The real test today is for those countries who preach and call others to respect international law and rule of law. So what will your position be now? The real test today is for those countries who preach and call others to stick to principles, respect the UN Charter, and to comply with the decisions of its organs and bodies. So what will your position be now? The real test today is for those countries who watched the ongoing massacres and the genocide in Gaza for almost a year and witnessed the systematic destruction and dehumanization conducted by an apartheid regime for decades. So what will your position be now? On which side of history are you going to be on? What will the books of history say about you? What are you going to tell your people if you happen to vote against this resolution or even abstain? What excuse are you going to use to justify such decision? If you can't vote for peace and justice and against occupation and illegal settlements, how you'll be able to ask for support if one day you're occupied? How will you explain if your government supports in any way such occupation in violation of international law and not hold those who do so accountable? And what will you say to those who will aim at you and say, "Welcome to the world of double standards"? And talking about double standards, just a while ago, we heard the representative of the occupying Israeli forces bashing you all, as he does with his predecessors, perform a show and teaching us and lecturing us about humanity and morality, totally disconnected from reality. Even today, he couldn't bring any justification nor speak about the topic we're discussing, the illegal settlements. He could not address the resolution and trying to show that the world started only on October the 7th, neglecting the fact of history. Well, if he considers this assembly a circus, guess what? I consider him a clown performing in this place, always bringing his preps, trying to produce a show, failing to make us laugh, deceiving us from reality. That's what they try to do, but they fail dramatically. So when I ask him if he thinks this place is a circus, why are you performing in it? Why are you still a member in it? Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for you to show action and not words. Nearly a year will pass and the massacres and genocide in Gaza and the West Bank is continuing. The inability of the international community, especially the Security Council, to stop these atrocities and reach a ceasefire, and the silence of many of you, is what allowed the killing of tens of thousands, injuring hundreds of thousands, the displacement of almost 2 million, the spread of famine and diseases. So today, do some justice for those innocent and vote in favor of this resolution, which would be a message from the world to the occupying forces and who support them blindly. Say enough is enough, and it's time to act. Libya reaffirms its position that it won't define resistance against occupation as terrorism, and who from your countries didn't gain their independence without resistance, especially when the doors of peaceful solutions are completely shut down. Libya affirms its position that the only peaceful solution to this 7 decades of aggression and occupation is by recognizing the Palestinians' right to defend themselves and resist occupation and the right of self-determination, and having an independent state with Jerusalem, its capital. In conclusion, it's time now for all to comply and respect the outcome of the ICJ. This court, which we all know has established or was established to help in ensuring peace and justice, where international law should prevail over the use of force. Therefore, we call on you all to vote in favor of this resolution to pave the road for peace. History will remember those countries which have taken a principle, a moral, a legal or humane stance, and it will also remember those who had their humanity in deep coma and were aware and deliberately participated in this live broadcasted atrocity, especially the 21st century Holocaust, the Holocaust of Gaza. Voting in favor of this resolution today is a vote for peace, and it's a vote for justice. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Libya. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Jordan.
Mr. President, at the outset, I congratulate you on your election as President of the General Assembly in its 79th session. I thank you for responding to our request to resume the 10th Emergency Special Session. United for Peace. Jordan aligns itself with the statements of the Arab Group, OIC, and NAM. Mr. President, our session today convenes to look into the draft resolution tabled by the Brotherly Palestinian delegation in light of the advisory opinion of the ICJ, which was issued in July, concerning the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, in response to the request of the General Assembly end of 2022. Jordan expresses its full support of the draft resolution, and we invite the Member States to vote in its favor. Mr. President, Jordan considers the advisory opinion of the ICJ a watershed moment in the history of the Palestinian question. The opinion stated what we are aware of, which is that the Israeli occupation is illegal and that the presence of Israeli settlements and settlers in the occupied Palestinian territories is illegal and void, and that the Israeli practices against the Palestinian people languishing under occupation are racist practices in the first place that amount to racial discrimination and apartheid. Mr. President, Implementing the ICJ's advisory opinion is an obligation for us as states, international organizations, and international community. In this advisory opinion, the Court has reflected the position of international law from the Palestinian question, from the Israeli occupation and the Palestinian right to self-determination, and from the grave Israeli violations of the jus cogens of international law. In the near future, we will see how the content of this advisory opinion will be reflected in the legal procedures that will be adopted by the national and regional courts and by member states against the occupation and against Israeli practices. In line with the advisory opinion and the submission submitted by Jordan before the ICJ, we reaffirm the fact that Israeli policies in the occupied Palestinian territories aim at undermining the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. The international community cannot allow this. Therefore, we emphasize the need to compel Israel to implement the advisory opinion in this regard, including ending the ongoing Israeli occupation since June 1967 as soon as possible, and immediately ending all the settlement activities, evacuating the settlers from the occupied Palestinian territories, and ending their arbitrary oppressive practices against the Palestinian people on their occupied territories. Mr. President, we reiterate our full support to the advisory opinion, which compels Israel to restore properties to their legal owners and to provide compensation to those affected by the Israeli practices and policies in the occupied Palestinian territory. We also support the measures included in the Palestinian draft resolution, including ending the import and procurement of goods manufactured in settlements and also ending the provision of weapons to Israel, in addition to ending all measures ending violations aiming at changing the historic status quo of the holy sites in Jerusalem. Refraining from providing support to Israel to continue its crimes and violations against the Palestinian people is not an intellectual luxury. It is a legal obligation on all states and on the international community as a whole. Those supporting the settlements should refrain from doing so, and the companies feeding the Israeli killing machinery against the Palestinian people should also refrain from doing so, and those supporting the measures of Israel aiming at creating a new reality on the ground against Palestine should understand that this is bound to fail. Mr. President, the advisory opinion emphasized the unity of the Palestinian territory and the right of return of the Palestinians. It rejected forced displacement. Therefore, there is a need to implement this advisory opinion using all possible legal means by adopting the necessary national legislations, in addition to the individual and collective measures to implement that goal. There is also a need to intensify international efforts to put further pressure on Israel to end their hideous crimes against the Palestinian people in Gaza, which have claimed the lives of tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians since the onset of the barbaric Israeli war a year ago. The Security Council and the international community should put pressure on Israel to end the war immediately and to allow the sufficient and sustainable delivery of humanitarian assistance to the Gaza Strip, and to refrain from targeting UN and relief staff, and to implement relevant Security Council resolutions, mainly Resolution 2735. We call upon the international community to take a unified position condemning the ongoing unilateral Israeli practices and their violations of the historic status quo in Jerusalem. The international community should compel Israel and its extremist government to end their violations in the West Bank and policies aiming at dragging the region into a global regional war with devastating consequences. In conclusion, Mr. President, we reiterate the historic and absolute support of Jordan to the right of Palestinians to self-determination and to the establishment of their sovereign independent state along the lines of the 4th of June 1967, with occupied East Jerusalem as a capital, pursuant to relevant UN resolutions and on the basis of the two-state solution, which is the only way to achieve comprehensive peace. We reaffirm the need for Israel to respect the historic status quo of Jerusalem and the Islamic and Christian holy sites in the frame of the Jordanian custodianship on these sites. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Jordan, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, we gather today to discuss the question of Palestine, a stark reminder of the importance of multilateral action, but at the same time, a proof of the limit of its frameworks, including these very United Nations. On the one hand, without the international law, without the global fora of nations, the Palestinian cause would have faded into oblivion in a world dominated by narrow interests. On the other hand, multilateral action has shown its limitation, despite the consensus of the international community and the successful binding resolution that plainly affirm and reaffirm the Palestinian rights to self-determination, Palestinian right to their land, Palestinian right to their statehood. Yes, we find ourselves unable to enforce them. This failure stems from an occupying power that disregards international law and thrives on impunity, acting as though it is above the law. In Gaza, in the West Bank, the Israeli occupier continue to kill, continue to arrest, with the toll of victims surpassing in nearly 1 year 41,000 martyrs, almost 100,000 wounded, and more than 10,000 Palestinian detainees. The Israeli occupying power desecrates holy sites of Al-Quds Sharif and forcibly displace its people. Just this morning, we witnessed another assault from Israeli settlers protected by the Israeli police into the mosque of Al-Aqsa. The occupying power openly denies the right of the Palestinian people and seeks to undermine the establishment of their states. Mr. President, in light of this bleak reality, which threatens to extinguish hope in the heart of the Palestinians and peace lovers around the world, the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice came. This historic and comprehensive decision by the highest judicial body in the world challenges the Israeli occupation narrative and exposes its apartheid policies. It reaffirms the illegality of Israel occupation of Palestinian territories and the need to its end. Now, as President Abdelmajid Tebboune has emphasized, and I quote, "We, the advocates of the just peace, bear the responsibility to end the historic injustice inflicted on the Palestinian people, an outcome achievable only by compelling the occupying power to comply with international law." End of quote. Mr. President, the voice of justice has spoken, and it is imperative that we shall all abide by its ruling. Failing to do so will disrupt the very foundations of the international order. We should ensure the full implementation of the ICJ advisory opinion. For this purpose, the State of Palestine submitted to the General Assembly this historic draft resolution. And this draft is historic in its significance, as it is the first resolution submitted by the State of Palestine in its national capacity in the history of the United Nations. It is another victory on the path to full membership to the United Nations. It is also historic in its content, as it outlines a roadmap to end the occupation and enable the Palestinian people to fully enjoy their rights. My country, Algeria, having always stood by Palestine, promptly sponsored this draft resolution and called on all members to support it, to vote in favor of it. Today, we must be united in our support, in our solidarity with the Palestinian people. We must stand together in defense of international law. We must stand united for peace. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Algeria, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States.
Mr. President, the United States has worked with determination to support a comprehensive peace agreement that would permanently resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There is no other path that both guarantees Israel's security and future as a democratic Jewish state and ensures Palestinians can live in peace and dignity in a state of their own. Consistent with this position, we have long opposed unilateral measures that undermine the prospect of a two-state solution. That includes the advancement of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and it includes the resolution that the Palestinian delegation has put before us today. For the better part of 4 decades, the United States has been clear about our policy concerns with Israel's program of settlements. Earlier this year, we also expressed the view that the program of settlements is inconsistent with international law. We maintain firm opposition to settlement expansion, which in our judgment only weakens Israel's security. The United States also respects the important role of the International Court of Justice in advising the UN General Assembly and in helping peacefully settle disputes. However, adoption of a one-sided resolution that selectively interprets the substance of the ICJ's opinion does not advance what we all want to see, and that is progress toward 2 states living in peace, side by side. This proposed resolution advances the flawed and indeed false idea that adopting a text here in New York can somehow resolve what is easily one of the most complex and persistent diplomatic challenges of our time. Colleagues, we all know that is not true. We all know, as the Security Council has repeatedly underscored, that a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict must be achieved through negotiations between the 2 parties. Negotiations grounded in some basic principles, including the notion of land for peace. Regrettably, but very significantly, the Palestinian resolution makes no mention of this reality. It also fails to acknowledge, among other things, that Hamas, a terrorist organization, is currently exerting power, control, and influence in Gaza. And it refuses to address the reality that Israel, a United Nations member state, simply has a right to protect and defend its people from acts of terror or violence. I understand the last few months have been devastating for the Palestinian people. Families have endured hell in Gaza and the West Bank due to the new round of fighting Hamas set in motion on October 7th. But the resolution put forward by the Palestinian delegation does nothing to end the current conflict with Hamas in Gaza, nothing to bring the hostages home to their families, and nothing to surge life-saving assistance to Palestinian civilians in Gaza. It does not offer a concrete path forward for how, consistent with Security Council Resolution 2735, the Palestinian Authority in Gaza intends to reunify the Gaza Strip with the West Bank. It does not address calls for reform of the Palestinian Authority, not only from the international community, including numerous Arab states, but also from the Palestinian people. And despite the fact that Hamas just upended ceasefire negotiations by brutally murdering 6 hostages, and despite the fact that Hamas continues to use Palestinian civilians as human shields in Gaza, this resolution does not include any measures to pressure Hamas to heed Security Council Resolution 2735, accept the deal on the table, and implement it without delay or further conditions. Colleagues, using inflammatory language in this text is not going to advance the cause of peace. Demanding every member state impose economic sanctions on Israel and its officials is not going to reinvigorate the peace process, let alone create a path toward a 2-state solution. Creating more special committees and convening a conference ostensibly for no other purpose than to pressure Israel is not a viable substitute for the one thing we all know, and that is the Security Council and General Assembly have long agreed is necessary to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that is direct negotiations. Rather, and much like other symbolic gestures pursued by the Palestinian delegation in recent months, many of which do little or nothing to alleviate the suffering of the Palestinian civilians in Gaza, this resolution is a stark reminder that there are no shortcuts to peace. Colleagues, in the dark months since October 7th, I've heard and sensed a feeling of hopelessness regarding the prospects for peace, not only between Israeli and Palestinians, but more broadly in the region. But we must not be guided by fear and despair. We know what needs to be done to achieve peace, starting with an immediate ceasefire with hostage release based on the principles of Security Council Resolution 2735. The United States will continue to do everything possible to put forward ideas and proposals to achieve a deal that would help lay the foundation for a better future for Israelis and Palestinians alike. But there is no path forward or hope offered through this resolution today. Its adoption will not save Palestinian lives, bring the hostages home, end Israeli settlements, or reinvigorate the peace process. For that reason, I urge you to vote no and to instead join the United States in pressing both parties, Israelis and Palestinians, to recommit to the hard work of direct negotiations and to press Hamas to take the deal on the table. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, my delegation would like to align itself with the statements delivered by the Syrian Arab Republic on behalf of the Arab Group, Cameroon on behalf of the OIC, and Uganda on behalf of NAM. At the outset, I would like to congratulate you, Mr. President, and your Vice Presidents on assuming the presidency of the General Assembly in its 79th session. We wish you every luck, and we thank you for resuming the 10th emergency special session to follow up on the advisory opinion of the ICJ on the legal consequences arising from Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and from the illegality of Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. The ICJ concluded on the 19th of July 2024 that the ongoing presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory is illegal. It must be ended, and the resulting settlement activities must be addressed. The ICJ also found that Israel is obligated to provide reparation for damages, and that international organizations, including the United Nations, are required not to recognize the legality of the situation resulting from this illegal presence. The advisory opinion was issued based on the request of the GA in its Resolution 77/247 on the 30th of December 2022. Mr. President, my country welcomed the advisory opinion of the ICJ on Israel's policies and practices, and we welcome the fact that it confirmed the illegality of Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. Mr. President, maintaining international peace and security is among the top priority of this organization. Today, it is evident that this organization was either late or was unable to carry out this role. Its delay in reaching a just and comprehensive solution for the Palestinian question caused a humanitarian tragedy for decades and led to the tragic consequences that we are witnessing today. Israel, the occupying power, is perpetrating all forms of crimes against the Palestinian people.
it ignores the resolutions of international legitimacy, international law, and international humanitarian law. It even believes that it is above these resolutions and the law. It believes that it has immunity against accountability. This is why it persists in its aggressive policies, and it persists in perpetrating all forms of crimes and in carrying out procedures to violate the Palestinian rights. Mr. President, the advisory opinion of the ICJ is in line with the belief of the international community regarding the rights of the Palestinian people. It reaffirms that illegal Israeli practices that went on for decades continue to escalate violations against the Palestinian people. We look forward for an immediate follow-up to implement this advisory opinion to address this historic injustice that has lasted for far too long. The international community, represented by the General Assembly of the United Nations, is called upon to guarantee the respect of this advisory opinion and is called upon to monitor the implementation of the obligation of Israel, the true activation that we all aspire to, of the role of the United Nations commences with respecting its resolutions and strengthening the role of its bodies. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia looks forward to the adoption of today's draft resolution, and we call on peace-loving nations to vote in favor of this resolution as it reaffirms the respect of the international community for the advisory opinion of the ICJ. It reaffirms Palestinian rights and reaffirms the beginning of a process towards peace. We also reaffirm the need for practical and credible steps to reach a just and comprehensive solution for the Palestinian question pursuant to the Arab Peace Initiative and the resolutions of international legitimacy in order to guarantee the rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination and the establishment of an independent state along the lines of 1967 with East Jerusalem as its capital. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Norway.
Mr. President, the advisory opinion of 19 July by the International Court of Justice is a highly important ruling from the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. The Court's message could hardly have been any clearer. Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory constitutes a wrongful act of a continuing character. This has been brought about by Israel's violations of the prohibition on the acquisition of territory by force and the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. Consequently, the Court states that Israel has an obligation to bring an end to this unlawful presence as rapidly as possible. The Court also reaffirms that Israel's settlement activity violates international law and furthermore concludes that Israel must immediately stop all new settlement activity, evacuate all settlers from the occupied Palestinian territory, repeal all legislation and measures creating or maintaining the unlawful situation, and provide full compensation to all affected Palestinians. This is an unequivocal message which Israel must comply with without delay. The Court further emphasizes that all other states are required to not assist in the maintenance of the illegal situation created by Israel. It urges the UN General Assembly and the Security Council to consider measures to help put an end to the illegal presence. This places a responsibility on all of us. A resolution building on ICJ's advisory opinion will be put to a vote. It is aligned with the Court's opinion and aims at ensuring that the latter is upheld. Norway will therefore vote in favour. And we encourage everyone to do the same. Respect for international law is a prerequisite for maintaining global peace and security. Mr. President, turning to the dramatic situation on the ground, Norway continues to call for an immediate ceasefire and the release of all remaining hostages who remain in captivity after Hamas's terror attack on 7 October, which we have condemned in the strongest possible terms. After more than 11 months of war, the situation in Gaza is catastrophic. The scale of destruction, the massive number of casualties, and the extreme humanitarian needs are unprecedented. The living hell that the civilians in Gaza are going through every single day is happening on our watch. No one can claim that we do not understand the extent of the ongoing violence and destruction. Still, we have been unable to prevent it. That is unforgivable. In the occupied West Bank, the rapidly deteriorating situation is highly dangerous.